Well, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. This is a podcast where we explore thoughts in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. If you guys like this podcast, then please go give me a 5-star review on Apple Podcast. Subscribe to the channel if you're watching on YouTube. That would be huge. I got a lot of awesome conversations with a lot of awesome people. And today is another awesome conversation with another awesome person. I have with me again Dr. Ryan Mullins, and we're going to be talking about his paper, Demarcating the Difficulty with Demarcating Panentheism. So panentheism is different than pantheism, different than theism, supposedly, but Ryan's found some problems with that. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Without further ado, let's just bring Ryan in. Hey, thanks so much for coming back on the podcast, man.
Yeah, anytime. This is always good stuff.
I always have a hard time introducing like what you're doing. Can you just tell us real quick, like where are you at? What are you doing for the audience here?
Yeah, so I'm currently at the University of Helsinki. So I'm a part of this thing called the Collegium for Advanced Studies. So it's like an interdisciplinary research institute, primarily in the humanities and social sciences. And so I'm just doing a senior research fellowship where I'm just working on my next book, which is called From Divine Time Maker to Divine Watchmaker, and then like a million other papers on all sorts of projects, including one on panentheism, among other things.
Yeah, I was super excited about that because we read your paper. So I don't know if you know this or not, but a lot of people look to your paper as like the gold standard. A lot of professors that I've reached out to, they say that's the paper. That's the one you want to go to. We read it in class here at Trinity, and I had to present on it, but I chose to present it because I wanted to have you on. But it worked out perfect because you're kind of rehashing this again. So, man, I'm stoked to talk about it.
And I was really glad when you told me that this is that's the case, that people are looking at this paper, because I was really hoping that this would become the gold standard, and then I could eventually turn this into something like an intro book to models of God. So I really am glad people are interested in this.
Well, Ryan, is that what you're thinking about? So you said you're working on this again. Is this going to be another paper? Or is this a start to that Models of God book? What do you think?
It's a couple different papers I'm working on right now are going to eventually all go into a Models of God book. So the paper that I've been asked to do, Kirk Lougheed is doing a project on the Axiology of God. So like, should we want God to exist? What kind of value does God bring to the world, or disvalue? Because it might be the case, like if God has a particular nature, it'd be really horrible, like if God existed. So what Kurt is, the book proposal he's got in the works is looking at a bunch of alternatives to classical theism and going, should we want like open theism? Should we want pantheism? Like if a God like that existed, would that be good or bad? And so I've been asked to do the chapter on panentheism. And so trying to identify arguments for and against panentheism on those grounds of going, would this really be a good thing or a bad thing? And so it is part of the overall project of going, here are all the models of God. What are the options? What's good? What's bad?
Okay, awesome. Yeah, and we're going to get into a little bit of that today, different models. So for those looking for the paper, it's The Difficulty with Demarcating Panentheism, Sophia, 2016. But so as we kind of situate this conversation, what is the concept of God, and what is a model of God? Did you hear that, Ryan? Sorry about that.
Yeah. No, that's good. So the concept of God is that of the greatest metaphysically possible being, which is the single ultimate foundation of reality. And so that's like the really basic concept of God that I think all models of God are working with, or at least should be able to agree on. Like no model of God's going to own the market on saying that God is perfect and that God's the foundation of reality. So what a model of God does is it takes that really basic concept and tries to offer like a thicker articulation or conception of what it means for God to be perfect and what it means for God to be the foundation of reality. So it's going to extend the concept in some sort of like unique, particular conception of God. So what that typically looks like is specifying like a certain set of like great making properties that make God the greatest possible being, and then also specifying what sense God is the foundation of reality. So like a doctrine of creation ex nihilo could be one option, maybe like a eternal creation, or like maybe an emanation, depending on which way you want to go. Now, what most of the models of God agree on is that God is a necessarily existent being with properties like aseity, maximal power, maximal knowledge, maximal goodness, perfect rationality, and perfect freedom. And those are pretty much relatively uncontested. So what a model of God needs to do is specify a set of unique claims from its rivals that demarcate it or make it stand out. And then from there, you can start testing different models to see which ones are like internally coherent, which ones fit best with like different religious doctrines if you affirm a particular religion, and then which fit best with like reason and experience. So that's kind of the idea.
Okay, so I had Oliver Crisp on, and we talked a little tiny bit about models. In your conception of a model, is it like a map versus like a map of Australia versus like seeing Australia itself, or um, what do you think of when you think of a model?
Mhm.
Yeah, as an analogy.
Yeah, no, that's quite good. So like a model, in one sense, it is abstracted from the reality. So it's not going to give the full picture, and it's not meant
Okay.
to. It's trying to, but it is trying to map on. The better it maps on, the better the model is. So that is the idea, and so it's borrowed from philosophy of science, where they're trying to develop like theories, but there's more than just like it's usually like a set of trying to map like a conception of how to map things onto reality. It's going to have a bunch of like auxiliary theories built into it usually as well. But yeah, the better the map, the better the model. It would be one way to think about it.
Okay. Okay. So that brings us to like models of God being debated today.
So as I see it, there are five main models of God being debated today. And see, these would be called like classical theism. And there's neoclassical, or what sometimes is called like a modified classical theism. Then there's open theism, panentheism, and then pantheism.
Mhm.
And I take this classification scheme from Janine Diller and Asa Kasher's book, Models of God and Alternative Ultimate Realities.
Mm.
And then also just like reading through like a vast portion of the literature on the nature of God, and then looking at different books that are surveying these different issues, and then a bunch of different research grants and research institutes that have popped up over the years. So these are really the main models that are being discussed. There is a term that's sometimes used mainly in the internet called theistic personalism,
Mhm.
but it's a very, very coarse-grained concept, and I think it's very, very unuseful, like unhelpful. And I really can't stress that enough. So the classical theist Howard Robinson, like he points out that this like so-called dividing line between like classical theism and like theistic personalism is just like really greatly exaggerated, and it makes little sense when you look at what actual thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and Richard Swinburne say. So, and I think
Mhm.
Robinson's right about this. So, like personally, I think we do the world of theology a really big disservice when we continue to speak of like theistic personalism, because I don't know anybody who's really actually wanting to like affirm this really, really coarse-grained idea. Instead, I think what we need to do is look at, like, give a close examination at these actual models of God and what different thinkers who affirm these different models of God are actually saying. I think that's what the world of theology needs for a much better debate about the nature of God.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and you're kind of driving it home for me right now. I've thought about that a little bit, but your paper made that point as well, because you're looking through different panentheists and they're saying different things. And
Mhm,
it's like, well, oh yeah, we're individuals with different ideas. And so
mhm,
no two, maybe not no two neoclassical theists are going to be the same on everything.
mhm.
And so, yeah, that's an interesting point. There's a hardcore, as you mentioned in the paper,
Right.
which I thought was funny because I'm just thinking of your hardcore music when I
Right.
listen to your
Exactly.
podcast. I'm like, oh, hardcore, all right, but it's different.
Yeah. Yeah. I took the idea from
Okay, so
philosophy of
you've
science, but
talked.
yeah.
Oh, okay, I love that. Well, you've talked about a couple different models of God: classical, neoclassical, open theism, and we're dropping theistic personalism. That's out, folks. So stop using that one. Can you just really quick say, how do we demarcate those from each other?
Yeah. So, like I said before, all models of God agree that God's like a necessarily existent being with attributes like maximal power, maximal knowledge, and all that. So that's like one thing that these three theistic models are going to agree on. Another thing that they're all going to agree on is the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. So when it comes to understanding how God is the
Mm,
foundation of reality, like the classical, neoclassical, and open theists are all really clear that they're affirming that God creates the universe out of absolutely nothing. So there's going to be an ontological distinction between God and the universe, or a multiverse if God wants to create a multiverse, just cosmos, whatever that is. There's going to be some sort of ontological distinction between God and everything else. Now, what distinguishes these models from each other, though, is they're going to make a particular set of claims about the nature of God and about the modal scope of God's knowledge, or like how far God's knowledge extends. So the
mm,
classical theist is going to affirm four unique attributes, which are timelessness, immutability, simplicity, and impassibility. And then they're also going to affirm that the modal scope of God's knowledge extends all the way to the future. So there's different ways to kind of cash that out, but they're going to say there's some sort of exhaustive foreknowledge.
mhm,
The neoclassical theist is going to say, I like the foreknowledge stuff. I'll keep that. But one of those four, maybe all four, but one or more of those four classical attributes, they've got to go. Like
mm,
Linda Zagzebski's like impassibility, get rid of that. But she wants to keep the other three. William Lane Craig's going to be like, get rid of all those. Those are terrible. I don't want any of those. Get rid of them. Yeah. Then when you get to the open theist is like, definitely get rid of all four of those. Those are awful. Get rid of them. So William Hasker's like, they all got to go. And then what also needs to go, that whole like exhaustive foreknowledge stuff, that's got to go, because God does have some knowledge of the future. Like certain things are about the future are certain. Maybe like God's declared this is when Christ is going to come back. And so God's like, I know that. But what's like Parker going to do tomorrow with his own free will? I don't know. I got a good idea. I know the probability what he's going to do, but what he in fact will do, don't know.
Yeah.
So those are kind of the ways to distinguish these different models.
Okay. Ryan, do you find yourself nicely fitting in any of these?
At the moment, I want to go with the neoclassical view. John Peckham has really convinced me there's good biblical evidence for God having foreknowledge. My worry is trying to figure out the exact way to get the foreknowledge. So the Mullins story I really like, but it's got some grounding problems.
Yep.
Ryan Byerly has this nice account called the time ordering account, which basically gets you Mullinism at the end of the day, but it has a response to the grounding objection built into it. And that I find really interesting. I'm just still trying to think through some of the entailments here, because there's some really complicated philosophy of time stuff going on there.
Yeah. How about, just real quick, how about immutability? I know that you would want to qualify the others, but what do you think of immutability?
Yeah, so because when I was looking over the Sophia paper that we're talking about today, I used the phrase weak immutability. And Keith Yandel always told me that this is just terrible. It's awful to use these kind of phrases, because he's like, everyone always had a really clear idea of what immutability meant. When you start saying weak immutability, you're just muddying the waters. And I was like, I didn't want to give it up when I first wrote this paper. But later on, like for the God in Emotion book, for instance, I just got rid of it. I was like, immutability says no intrinsic or extrinsic change. I'm saying God does both. God can't change his nature, but that's not interesting, because you can't change your essence. So God can't cease to be like all powerful or something, but he can go from not exercising his power to exercising it. He can go from knowing that Parker does not exist to going, I'm sustaining Parker in existence now. He can do all those kind of changes. So I'm like, I don't really need the phrase immutability at that point, unless I want to be like really diplomatic and make the Southern Baptists think that like, I'm one of them or something,
Right.
I'm using the classical language in this really twisted way.
Yeah.
There's reasons you could do that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I found the whole thing very muddy just as it is, because most of the impetus for holding on to immutability is you don't want to say that God changes his nature, because on the popular level, you go, well, God's made promises. What are you saying? God can go back on his promises? And it's like, well, no, but that's not immutability. You're talking about God not changing at all. And so what the big, strong impetus for it is actually something that you can pick out yourself and say, no, God's nature does not change.
Yeah, exactly. Because when you look at open theists and panentheists and pantheists, none of them want to say that God's nature changes, because they're like, well, he has an essence, he has a nature. That's not changing. It changes in other ways, but not that. So I'm just like, no one really thinks this. And they've all got ways to explain why that's the case. So we don't really need immutability to explain that.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, because some of the guys that I interact with, if you let in change in the door, then everything's up for grabs.
Right.
Like, well, not if you tell a story about that and you have a coherent and it makes sense and it's not ad hoc, Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on. So we talked models of theism. So now we need to kind of demarcate pantheism in order to get at what panentheism is. So can you help us out with pantheism?
Yeah, so pantheists disagree on various things, but what they all share in common is they agree that like God and the universe or the multiverse, again, depending on how much you think exists out there. So God and the whole cosmos are identical. So you might be able to say like God and the universe are in a constitution relation because you don't think identity is a real thing in the world. So you're like, well, a constitution is what we're really after. That's a way you could go. But the big idea here is that God is not ontologically distinct from the universe. There's just this one substance that exists, and that substance is God. Everything else, like you, me, this couch I'm sitting on, is just a mode of God. There's only one substance, and it's just God. So that's panentheism in a nutshell, or pantheism in a nutshell.
Yeah. Okay. So in the paper, I think when you were responding to Clayton, or maybe it was Is it Gurky? I want to say Gurky.
I think it's Gurkha. The
Gurkha.
Germans have always tried to help me with the pronunciation here, and I just can't. There's
Gurkha
a
sounds
sound
right.
I cannot make.
Gurkha. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're responding to someone and you said, hey, they said world when they should have said universe, because universe refers to like the physical, and world includes all sorts, if you believe in abstracta, then it includes abstracta and God and everything in the conception of the world. So when we demarcate pantheism, do we want to say that God and the world are the same, or would they just say God and the universe are the same?
It depends what you want to go. So, as I understand that, a world is a maximally composable like proposition that describes the entire way things are.
Yeah.
So, if it's just God and nothing else, then that's the way the world is.
Mm-hmm.
If it's just a world filled with nothing but shrimp and only shrimp, for some reason I always go to this because it was in Buffy the Vampire Slayer to explain possible worlds. Like, that's a possible world. That's the way it goes.
Right.
If it's a multiverse, then that's the way the world is.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever all the stuff that exists is, if you're a pantheist, you're going to say there's God. All the other stuff is just modes of God. So if you want it to be a world filled with shrimp, or a world filled with a bunch of different universes, still just God at rock bottom.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. All right. So now why did panentheism come along? Like, what was the impetus for this via media between theism and pantheism?
Right. So part of the claim, okay, so one, you get a controversy up and running after the Reformation, which is this pantheist controversy. There's all sorts of like arguments about the nature of infinity that people start running, and people go, if I get infinity, then it seems like God's identical to the world. And some people are like, well, we don't want that, but we do want infinity, and we do want all this other stuff. Like, that sounds cool. So what if there's like a middle ground here? There's like some sort of like middle position. That's panentheism. And so what they'll say is that the universe is in God, but God is more than the universe. Mm-hmm. And so like the more than the universe, like that part is supposed to indicate that it's not pantheism. And then when we say the universe is in God, like that's supposed to somehow indicate we're not doing theism either. So it's pan-in-theism. That's supposed to be the idea. Here's some of the common claims you hear today, though, from panentheists, because there's a bit more going on today. What they'll do is they'll often say that their model of God is a really ancient model of God that you find across the world's religions. So even though the term panentheism isn't coined until the 19th century, they'll still say it's like a really old idea and it's very global. And then you'll also hear them say things like panentheism gives you a much more like relational and dynamic model of God. And I gather that relational and dynamic are good things. And then you'll also find them constantly saying that like they've got more like a more scientific view than their rivals. So like panentheism, like the way it's viewed today, is it's supposed to be like this sort of like magical unicorn that like unites all the religions and all the sciences together.
Yeah. Yeah. I've heard a lot more of the science one. I've heard some of the relational. I've definitely heard the science one, and I that's why I appreciated your article so much, because by the end you're like, hey, what are we even talking about here? You can't really claim, you can't make these really strong claims if you can't even demarcate yourself from the other views. Mm-hmm. Just real quick, we didn't talk about this, but where does process theology fit in with this? Are process theologians more tend towards panentheism, or are they just kind of the ugly stepchild trying to fit in somewhere? Where are they at?
Right. So as I see it, okay, so Charles Hartshorne is like one of the major thinkers for the process theist, and he says he's a panentheist. And then you see people like David Griffin saying the same thing. What they're doing, though, is, so I take a model of God to be one piece of a worldview. And this is what Benedict Gurkha says as well. He's like, a model of God is not your whole worldview, because your whole worldview includes all sorts of stuff. A model of God is just one piece of it. What I take process theism to be is a model of God, like panentheism, plus a particular metaphysical story of how other parts of the world hang together. So I think it's a much bigger claim. It's a worldview instead of a model of just a model of God.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense, because that's where I've heard a lot of the relational talk from the process folks, because they're like, look, it's so God's so relational that he's in process with his creation, and somehow there's this really strong dependence, but it's not quite identity relation. And yeah, okay, that's super helpful. So then what are some ways that panentheists have had tried to demarcate themselves from these other rivals?
So one of the reasons why I did this demarcation paper was because I just found it really difficult to figure out what was going on, because I saw a whole bunch of different metaphors being borrowed from different traditions and different models of God, and then that's supposed to be what panentheism is. But I take it like as obvious, like if you're borrowing a metaphor from a different model of God, that doesn't help you say anything unique about your model of God. And then like other panentheists, like they would talk about like there's all this diversity within panentheism, and I'm like, that's fine, like give me all the diversity you want, but like what's the thing that like is unique to you guys? Like what's the thing that like unifies all this different diversity? And so like what exactly is panentheism? Like if I became a panentheist tomorrow, what would I be affirming? Would I have to change my beliefs? I don't know. I couldn't tell. So here's one way like people will try to go. They'll say things like God is both immanent and transcendent on panentheism. But I find this utterly useless, because when you try to like really cash that out, it looks like it's just omnipresence. And so, for example, Philip Clayton, who's a contemporary panentheist, he says, what we need to do as a panentheist is maximize immanence. And I'm like, okay, what is that? And he's like, well, one possibility is omnipresence. And I'm like, well, but everybody affirms omnipresence. That's not interesting. And so like Gehor Gasser, like his work on this topic, he does the same thing. He's like, okay, well, let's really look at see what this in God means. And he's like, the best candidate is omnipresence. And then what he does is he says, well, that entails that there's no difference between classical theism and panentheism. And so here's a quote from Gasser. So Gasser says, as a consequence, classical theism and panentheism are not two rival accounts of God. Rather, they underline different aspects of one and the same God who's maximally transcendent and immanent at the same time. So that account, like this demarcation problem, it just stands. And Gehor knows that. He told that to me in person, and then he has a footnote where he says it too. He's like, doesn't solve the problem. Here's another common way I've seen people try to do it. They'll try to take like analogies from classical theism. And so they'll say like the universe is God's body in some sort of metaphorical sense. And I'm like, okay, cool. So you want to take a metaphor from classical theism and then tell me that this metaphor somehow makes you distinct from classical theism. Okay, sure. Now, there's something to be said here, though. I think when you look at other people, what they'll do is they'll give you a non-metaphorical account of what it would mean for the world to be God's body, what it would mean for the universe to be God's body. Where do those come from? Well, Richard Swinburne, who's an open theist, he gives you an account of that. And then T.J. Mawson, who's a classical theist, he gives you an account of that as well. And so I'm like, okay, maybe you don't have to borrow the metaphor. Maybe you could just borrow the literal ideas from other models of God. Is that going to help? I'll get to that in a second. Yeah. So what Swinburne does is he says, here's a whole bunch of different criteria for how you get embodiment. This is what it means for a person to be embodied in a particular like chunk of matter. And he says, omnipresence is not sufficient to satisfy all of those different criteria. So the universe, you could talk in some loose stretch sense to say the universe is God's body, but God's omnipresence alone doesn't satisfy all the different conditions. Yeah. T.J. Mawson pushes back and says, actually, all those other conditions that you had, Richard, like those are too strong. You don't need those. So omnipresence actually does satisfy everything you need to in order to say that the universe is God's body. Now, I'm not going to go into what those criteria are, because I think what's going on here is it's missing the point. And so here's the point. You're no longer making any unique claims about the nature of God. What all these different thinkers are doing is they're agreeing that God is omnipresent, and they're agreeing what it means to say that God's omnipresent. And then they're going, well, what does it mean to be embodied, though? And so now we're having a debate about what counts as a body. Yeah. And I'm like, well, you're supposed to be giving me some sort of unique claim about God, not about like what it means to be a body. So if panentheism is supposed to tell me something unique about God, well, the underlying claim is that God's omnipresent. Well, everybody says that. So if that's the only claim that it is, well, then everybody is a panentheist, because everybody affirms omnipresence, in which case then there's no demarcation between panentheism and its rivals. So we've got the collapse again.
Yeah. That was so helpful in reading your paper, where you have to say something unique about God. Stop. You keep going back to the universe, back to the bodies, back to this. Okay, cool. But as long as you're not saying something unique about God, then other people are going to be able to say that, and you have not sufficiently demarcated yourself from them.
Yes.
Especially since you're the one making all these claims about being scientific and relational. And
Right. Yeah. Because I'm like, give me something to back it up. Something interesting.
Yeah.
What is it? Yeah.
Yeah. So when you think like panentheists today, who are the pop? Is Philip Clayton like one of the leading guys? Because I always hear about Clayton, but I don't know how he's
Yeah.
kind of received in the academy.
He's such a nice guy. So and he's written a ton of books, a ton of papers. And so he really is kind of like, he's just like this cheerleader for like everything. So like when you're around him, you feel very encouraged.
Okay.
And so that's kind of when he's doing the panentheist project, like that's my take as well. He's like everybody who should be a panentheist. And I don't know what your review's saying, but like you should be a panentheist too. And I'm like, okay, well, what is this panentheism stuff? And so Clayton makes a few attempts at trying to demarcate panentheism. One attempt he makes is to say that God is the only substance that exists. And I'm like, well, but that's what the pantheist told me. So that's not going to help. But Clayton's like, well, hang on. There's more though. There's more of a difference. He says the pantheist denies that God is a temporal conscious knower. And so that's what's supposed to be so panentheism would say God is a temporal conscious knower, but pantheism would say he's not. I think that's just demonstrably false. So Andrei Bukharev is a contemporary pantheist, and he affirms that God is a temporal conscious knower. And then another contemporary pantheist, Tim Mander, like he points out that a very common historical argument for pantheism is to focus on omniscience. And omniscience involves God being a knower, in case you're wondering. Yeah. So like God knows all the things, including your own perspective. Why? Because your perspective is one of God's many modes. So he thinks that pantheism, and this is a very classical argument for pantheism, is that if God really knows all the things, then he needs to know what it's like to be Parker, and he needs to know I am Parker. And so he's got all the stuff.
That's like that's reminiscent of Zagzebski's subjectivity, right? Like,
it's a step further though, because on this like maximal empathy account that Zagzebski has, if I empathize with you, I know that you and me are not the same person. Yeah, because if I confuse like your perspective with mine, then I would have failed to empathize with you.
I guess the inclination there is that you can't empathize with yourself.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Interesting. All right. Sorry to get us down a rabbit trail there.
But that's one that like actually Andrei Bukharev tries to argue from omnisubjectivity to pantheism, and I go, it's not empathy anymore. But yeah, so Clayton though. So here's another like move that Clayton tries to do. So Clayton's written a response to my paper, and he says there's like two hardcore like claims from panentheism that demarcate it. And so he says first, like God is temporal, and then second, God is passible. And he's like, those are real hardcore claims. And I'm like, okay, well, but the neoclassical theists say that, and then all the open theists definitely affirm that, and then most pantheists also affirm that God's temporal and passible. So there's nothing here demarcating panentheism from its rivals. And then further, I guess to kind of like finally like put this to rest here, like, so if panentheism really is like this ancient model of God that you find across the world's religions, then like most of the alleged panentheists throughout history are not going to be affirming temporality or passibility. Like those really are like kind of more unique, more modern sort of claims. So when you look at the actual history of panentheism, you find theologians who affirm that God is timeless and impassible. And so here's an example of this. Karl Kraus, the guy who coined the term panentheism. He was like, God's timeless and impassible. And I'm like, okay. Wow. And then like Benedict Gerke points out, like most panentheists historically, they've said that God's not one being among many beings because they deny that God's temporal and impassible and mutable. I mean, one thing you could do, you could say, well, like Karl Kraus, I know you coined the term panentheism, and so therefore you claim to be an authority on panentheism since you came up with the term, but you don't know what it is. You don't really understand what it is. Like you could say that if you want, or you could just say this way of demarcating panentheism fails. Those are some of your options, I think.
Yeah, that is so tricky. Yeah, like you made up this word, but sorry, man, like you don't get it.
Yeah, I know.
But yeah, I'm like if you can't sufficiently demarcate it, maybe you don't get it, or maybe it's just an empty concept. And yeah, it's a nice word, and we kind of have a fuzzy concept of it, but when you try to pin it down, there's nothing really there, and really you're just pinning one of the other models of God on accident.
Right.
So how about Gerke? Does his is he able to demarcate it better, you think, than Clayton? Or
I do. So I'll go through kind of what I do in the paper, and then later on we'll talk about how I've changed my mind when we talk about some other questions. So like one of the things that Benedict does in one of his papers is he says this. He says that the only difference between classical theism and panentheism is the modal status of the universe. And so he tries to develop this in a couple different writings. And so the big idea is that, like, so all you like classical, neoclassical, you open theist, you affirm the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. And so what you're saying is that, like, the universe or the multiverse is contingent. Whereas a panentheist, what we're going to say is that creation ex nihilo, that's false. Get rid of it. And instead, the universe or the multiverse is necessary. Or here's the way, like, Tom Ord would put it. He says that, like, it's necessary that God creates something. Like, God has to exist with a universe of some sort. And so you call that, like, the necessity of the cosmos or something like that. Mm. So what I do in the first paper is I try to point out that, like, different classical theists, like Catherine Rogers and Hugh McCann, they accept that divine simplicity entails a modal collapse. And then there's a neoclassical theist named Klaas Cray, who says that God's goodness entails a modal collapse. Like, God has to create the multiverse in the best possible of all multiverses. Mm. And so what you do with this modal collapse is it entails that the universe is necessary. And so what I'm basically doing is going like, well, there's a classical theist, a neoclassical theist, and a panentheist. They're agreeing on something that they're not supposed to be agreeing upon. And so it seems like the demarcation like here fails.
Yeah.
Second, like, what I do in the paper is I point out that not all panentheists reject the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. And not all panentheists say that God must exist with a universe of some sort. So, like, Philip Clayton is an example of this. So he says that the doctrine of creation ex nihilo is true, and God does not have to exist with anything. God's free to just say, I don't want to create anything at all. But one of the things I point out that Benedict can do is he can just say, well, look, Ryan, like, these people are being really fuzzy. If I really want to be able to demarcate my view and give good arguments for the view after I demarcate it. So I don't really care if a couple different, like, contemporary thinkers, I don't care if Clayton, like, disagrees. What I'm saying is this is how you should demarcate panentheism. Mm-hmm. And I am now convinced that that is absolutely correct. Like, the only unique claim that I can discern is that panentheism should say that God must create and exist with a universe of some sort. And so that, like, it's just necessary that God create something. So you got to get rid of creation ex nihilo if you want to be a panentheist, as far as I can tell.
Okay.
There's one problem, though, before we move on to the next thing.
Yeah.
So one of the things I point out in the first paper is this doesn't really help you necessarily say anything unique about the nature of God.
No, you're still talking about the universe.
Exactly. Yeah. And then you also can't really figure out then, well, just so the universe has to exist. Well, how is that more relational? How is that more dynamic? How is that more scientific?
Yeah.
And it doesn't really illuminate that really catchy slogan, so that, like, the universe is in God. And this is something that Benedict himself actually complains. He's got a paper where he complains about all these panentheists, like, saying all sorts of stuff. And he's like, it seems like the only thing that unites us is this really catchy slogan that the world is in God, but God's more the world. And so I'm like, okay, that's fine. Cool. Benedict, I like what you've done here, but, like, how do you cash out this catchy slogan then? Like, what's going on?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so actually with McCann, so I like McCann. He would say that God has eternally created, because there's this whole problem with creation we've talked about in our last episode. I think it was 53 or something. Go check and listen to that one. Did God create time? But so there's a modal collapse, and that means that the universe is necessary. God had to necessarily create, but he still affirms creation ex nihilo. And so would that be sufficient to demarcate a panentheist from a classical theist, saying, well, yeah, they're both necessary. The creation is necessary on both accounts, but one has creation ex nihilo and panentheism doesn't. Would that be sufficient or no?
I don't think so. So I've done a lot more work on creation ex nihilo since writing this Sophia paper. So when you look at the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, it's, like, really robustly developed in the Christian and Islamic and Jewish traditions. It is trying very hard to say the universe has to be contingent. Because if the universe is co-eternal with God, so there's two claims here. One, the universe began to exist, and there's a state of affairs where God exists without anything at all. And then two, the universe is contingent. Whereas that was to contrast with either an emanationist scheme or an eternal creation. So on an eternal creation view, God somehow still like causes the universe to exist, like from his will, instead of just emanating from his nature. But the universe is co-eternal with God. There's never a state of affairs where God exists without the universe. And for the medieval views, on their understanding of modality, if something is eternal, it is necessary. So they would just see, like, an eternal creation, that just means creation is necessary. And that's exactly what the creation ex nihilo was meant to say. It was like, well, no, we want it to be contingent. So that's why it hasn't always existed. So that's some of the stuff there. So I would just go, McCann, I see what you're up to, but you just haven't understood the full account of what creation ex nihilo really says. You've actually bought into a doctrine of eternal creation.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the scariest thing there is something you brought to my attention earlier, and probably in the last podcast, but about eternal generation. And so, if you want to say that the Son is eternally generated, and you don't want to be an Arian, well, there was never a time when Christ was not. Okay, well, you're also saying there's never a time when creation was not. And so if creation is on par with the Son, then you might accidentally be making yourself, it's eternal, but so is creation. So you might be accidentally committing yourself to some form of Arianism.
It wouldn't be Arianism because you'd be avoiding Arianism, because you've got the Son. God the Son's always existed, and you've got the universe always existed. But you'd be losing, I guess, the distinction between, well, what's the difference between begotten and made in the creed? Because the difference between was supposed to be like one has a beginning, the universe, and the other one doesn't, and you've lost that. And so whatever the response to the Arians, that's gone.
Yeah,
that would be. I think that's the entailment. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and so then maybe you'd have to make eternal generation some form of emanation or something like that, which I don't know what you'd have to do, but it's scary nonetheless.
You're gonna have to do something. Yeah.
Right.
What do you guys want to do? I mean, we can leave it up to them to figure out, but they're gonna have to make some kind of move.
Right. So then moving on to your hardcore of panentheism, I thought this was really interesting, and well, let's just jump into it and then we can continue on. But you end up you want to make metaphysical space and time attributes of God for the panentheists, not yourself. But can you explain like what that means for us?
A little bit, yeah. So I originally hated this proposal, but then JT Turner reminded me that like I'd come up with it like one night, and he's like, come on, you put that in the paper. You know how to demarcate it, and I'm like, okay, fine. So like what I do is I'm like, okay, here's a way to literally say that the universe is in God. And so now we've got a way to cash out that catchy panentheistic slogan. And so first what you do is you say there's this absolute space and there's absolute time. And so on an absolute theory of space and time exists regardless of whatever like physical or non-physical objects exist within space and time. So for instance, like the universe might just cease to exist, but space and time would remain. Now, second, what you do is then you say absolute space and time, those are divine attributes. They're attributes of God. And so what we did on the previous episode when I was on your show, we talked about how you could do that with time. I don't know quite yet how to do that with space though. Mm-hmm. We'll ask like Ross Inman to figure that out for us, I guess. But here's what the payoff would be for the panentheist. You would have a way of literally saying that the universe exists in God because the universe exists in space and time. And then you also quite literally can say that God is more than the universe because space and time, God, can exist without the universe. And so you have a non-metaphorical way of capturing that like really catchy panentheistic slogan.
Yeah, this was interesting. Just to kind of think about for myself, how did the panentheists receive that proposal that you gave them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was interesting to find out because I only found this out. I think it was maybe 6 or 7 months ago when I started looking into it. So like Benedict, he had told me like ages ago though, over like email, that he thought my paper like was not too far off from like his own views. So he thought like there was, he's like really sympathetic. And so I'm like, cool, I got at least one panentheist who's like sympathetic to the proposal. Philip Clayton, he wrote a response to it, to my paper, and he says that I solved the demarcation problem. Like my proposal solves it. And then he actually says that like this is exactly what the panentheists should say. They should make space and time attributes of God. And I'm like, okay. So I've got 2 panentheists who are really sympathetic to the proposal. And then Oliver Crisp, who's not a panentheist, but he's like written on the topic. He also published a response, and he said that my way was at least one way of demarcating panentheism. So some people at least think that there's something to this demarcation. So maybe I'm onto something. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. So you brought up how in our last conversation we talked about making time an attribute of God. I'm sorry, Brad. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry, man. Yeah, the TIU Wi-Fi is killing me right now. In our last conversation, we talked about time being an attribute of God, and then I read your paper here, and I was really nervous that maybe metaphysical or absolute time and absolute or metaphysical space can't come apart. And so if they can't come apart, then we would both be on the hook for metaphysical space being in God. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of options I think you've got here. One is to just say, well, look, the real hardcore commitment of panentheism, at least according to like Benedict Goeke, Thomas Ord, and like Mikhail Stenmark, and I think they're right, is to say that like the real unique claim is that you reject creation ex nihilo and you think that God has to exist with a universe of some sort. And so if that's the real unique claim of panentheism, then you could go with this sort of like, divine attributes or space and time view and say, well, here's a bunch of other people who affirm creation ex nihilo. Samuel Clarke, Isaac Newton, Nicole Orsamy. They said that space and time are attributes of God, and they affirm creation ex nihilo. They also think God is free to just refrain from creating anything whatsoever. And then Clarke and Newton, they also go further. They're like, God could have created the universe sooner if he wanted to. So it really is the case that like God's got a lot more freedom over creation, whether or not it exists, when it exists, than the panentheists would allow. And so I'm like, okay, here's an interesting claim. Space and time are attributes of God, but it's not unique to panentheism. But you've got some more options. Here's another option. One option you could do is you could go, well, I don't really like this idea of like space-time. Like I want to make them come apart. So that way I can say time is an attribute of God, but space is not. How do you do it? Well, first you can go, well, special theory of relativity, it didn't originally have space-time as a single entity in it. Like that was not part of Einstein's original development of it. That's something Minkowski developed later because it made the equations easier. And so I'm like, okay, cool. So I don't necessarily need space-time in order to do special theory of relativity. Well, then also further than that, you can go, well, I like a lot of different like, contemporary theories within quantum mechanics, they make space and time come apart again. So space-time just doesn't really work at all. It doesn't fit with it whatsoever. They come apart again. So I'm like, okay, there's some motivation within physics to go make space and time come apart. And there's a whole bunch of other people too who are just going, well, this whole idea of space-time, it's a fiction that gives us some useful predictions. It doesn't actually have like any metaphysical or ontological weight to it. It's just a fiction. And so you could go, all right, I don't want to be a panentheist. I don't want like space being an attribute of God, but I like that whole time stuff. Ryan was right about that. That's really cool. So what you could do is you could just go space and time. They're not the same thing. Time, absolute, cool. Make it an attribute of God. Space, I don't know what to say about space. Maybe it's absolute. Maybe it's relational. I don't know. And what would it even mean to say that it's an attribute of God? At this point, I just don't know. So you could happily just like cut that apart and just make these things different things and keep the time, but get rid of the space stuff. Yeah. But I don't understand absolute space well enough. Like Ross Inman's done some really good work on this, and I've had some conversations with him over several years ago when we were overlapped at Notre Dame about this. I just don't know what to say about space yet, so I can't make like a good competent judgment. I think on whether or not we should say space is an attribute of God.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was thinking of Ross Inman, his view of his recapturing of immensity, and I thought, I defended your demarcation in class because I thought, well, is Ryan Mullins really saying anything unique about God? Isn't this just immensity? And then I talked about how it's actually the converse. It's the opposite. It's like diametrically opposed. So instead of God being everywhere that there is, like immensity, like wherever there's a space, God will fill that space. The space is in God, and wherever anything is going to exist, it will be inside of him. Yeah. And you can make some flowery metaphorical language, and maybe the panentheists will like this, but it's like, it's like God's womb, and the world fills his womb or something. It's like, yeah, I would never say that ever, but you guys say some other weird stuff I wouldn't say either. So, so that's kind of how I think of immensity and absolute space. But again, I have no idea, and if you don't know, then I'm definitely not going to know because I've just picked it up from you.
What you said sounds right to me, but again, like, yeah, I just feel when it comes to space, I just find myself out of my depths. I really do.
Yeah. Well, I feel the same. Real quick, can we talk about like panpsychism and idealism?
Mhm.
Are those so? Some idealists will say, some Christian idealists will say that the universe exists as a thought in God's mind or a set of propositions in God's mind or whatever. Is that panentheism?
It's not supposed to be. Okay, well, there's some people who are interested and want it to be that case. So Sam Liebens, he's got a new book called The Principles of Judaism. And then him and Tyrone Goldschmidt have a series of papers trying to argue that theism just entails idealism. But one of the things they do really clearly in their papers and in Sam's book is to say this is not panentheism and it's not pantheism, because they're like, we don't want that.
Yeah.
But Sam's like, I do like the idea that like the universe is just ideas in the mind of God. So you're an idea, I'm an idea. All this stuff is just ideas. I've got a paper that I'm working on, and that Sam's our plan is to have Sam like write a response to it, going, this isn't theism or doctrine of creation, because you don't get creation at all. Because that claim that they want is that you still get a creation ex nihilo.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, okay, creation ex nihilo means that the universe is not co-eternal with God. There's some sort of state of affairs where God exists without the universe. And Sam's really clear in his definition that that's part of creation ex nihilo. And I'm like, okay, well, if we just are God's ideas, that's it. Well, God's always had his ideas. They're co-eternal with God. God's not free to exist without them. There's no state of affairs where God existed without his ideas. We don't have creation ex nihilo anymore. Further, you'd also get a modal collapse, because all of God's ideas are about all possibilities. Yeah. And so that means if all the universes that could exist, they just do exist because they're God's ideas, you're going to have like a modal collapse. You're going to have some kind of, or maybe some sort of modal realism or something like that. And Sam's like, oh, I don't like that. So he's like, I'm going to have to do some fancy footwork to respond. So that's kind of like one of the projects like we're going to do hopefully in the future, is to try to tease this out and be like, this doesn't seem like it gets you anything you want. And he's like, I'll give you everything that I want.
Well, that's super interesting, because the work I've done on the authorial analogy, some folks want to say, well, okay, that's fine, but just make it idealism. You know, God is the author of the world and it exists in his mind. And I want to say, no. It's outside of himself. I still want creation ex nihilo. I still want creation on its own, though him still upholding it. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to your work on that. And I got to do more work on creation ex nihilo as well. It'll be interesting to see what he says about, maybe like the intentions, like you have, I don't know. I'm just thinking of a bunch of random stuff that he could respond with, but we'll see. Yeah. I'm on your side on that one. How about panpsychism? Cause that to me seems like the philosophical version of panentheism, but maybe I'm totally off there.
Yeah, because I know several people got really excited about this. And so a couple of years ago, people were asking me, is this a way to do it? And I was like, well, what is it telling you about God? Well, nothing. So all you're doing is saying there's a whole bunch more conscious stuff in the world than we thought. And so, well, God could create a universe ex nihilo that he didn't have to create at all. And it could be a panpsychist world. And so I'm like, okay, well, the core claim was supposed to be that universe has to exist, that God has to create it. Okay, well, you could also be a classical theist and say like God's timeless, immutable, he's not really related to the universe, all the other stuff you want to say, and he creates freely ex nihilo, like a panpsychist world. So there's just more conscious stuff than you thought. And so I just don't think so. Basically, I guess as I see it, it comes down to this: saying that there's more conscious stuff in the world than you originally thought. That doesn't help illuminate what it means to say the universe is in God and that God's more than the universe. It doesn't help illuminate that it's more scientific or it's more relational, it's more dynamic. It just says, yeah, there's a few more conscious things than you thought.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's helpful. That's really helpful. Okay. I think you're definitely right on that one. The pan in there makes it sound, oh yeah, they're related. There's pan. It's all. Yeah. Well, so now you're working on panentheism again, and from just what I've seen online and talk with you a little bit, you're less optimistic about how you've characterized the hardcore of panentheism. Can you go into that? Why do you think that is? What's changed?
So, because like I originally thought there was a lot to say about this identifying space and time as divine attributes, but then when I started reading more, like people like Benedict Goeke and then Tom Oord and Mikhail Stenmark, they really convinced me that, well, the real hardcore claim of panentheism is that God has to exist with a universe of some sort. And I'm like, okay, because they're like, it's denying creation ex nihilo. You have to affirm like an eternal creation or an emanation, one of those. And I'm like, right. well, then I can identify, like I mentioned earlier, I can identify a bunch of people who affirm creation ex nihilo, who think that God is free to exist without anything whatsoever, and they're happy to say the universe, happy to say that space and time are divine attributes. So like Samuel Clarke and Isaac Newton would be cases of this. And so I'm like, what I have then is it seems like I've got this cool way for the panentheists to cash out their catchy slogan, but it's not unique to panentheism. So it would basically be kind of like the case of omnipresence, where it's like, okay, well, sure, like you could say like God's like maximally like immanent in the universe because he's omnipresent. Well, lots of people say that. So you've not done anything unique. And so I think that would be the case too with making space and time attributes of God. Like not everybody wants to say that. So it's more unique than omnipresence.
Yeah.
But a bunch of people who want to reject all sorts of other like panentheistic claims can affirm it and have in fact affirmed it.
Yeah. Yeah. I wonder, we talked about this a little bit earlier, so like Swinburne will say, yeah, in a metaphorical sense, maybe, I don't know if he'd say analogical, it's a little stronger, but in some sense, the world can be parsed as God's body. And the panentheists would want to say like, what you say metaphorically or non-literally, I say literally, that it's really the case that the world is God's body. And so maybe here too, they want to say, they would want to demarcate themselves by saying these other folks are referring to this relation, this eternal relation between God and the world in an analogical. No, they wouldn't say that. That doesn't even work.
It wouldn't help. I mean, a lot of panentheists are happy with the doctrine of analogy. That's worth saying, because sometimes Thomists think that classical theism owns the market on analogy.
Right.
And when you look at the actual history of ideas, a bunch of classical theists did not affirm analogy at all. Doesn't really exist until Aquinas. And then B, lots of contemporary thinkers who reject classical theism. So like John Peckham thinks all language about God is analogical. A bunch of open theists like Richard Rice think all language about God is analogical. Arthur Peacock, who's a panentheist, and then Mark Johnston, who's a panentheist, are all like, yeah, analogy. And then Mark Johnston's like, I'll do you one more. I really like Aristotelian stuff. I really like this hylomorphism stuff. Panentheism. And you're like, ooh, okay. So these kind of moves, they're interesting, but I don't think they're not going to be demarcating because they're not saying anything unique about God that other people are not saying as well.
Yeah, that's such a high bar. That's such a good. You just like hammer them with that. What are you saying about God? And I think it's so helpful for me to be thinking through as well. For the panentheists, so they're going to have to be committed. You're saying that they're going to have to be committed to eternal creation, eternal universe. These are the folks who are saying that their view is more scientific. Not all of them have said this, but doesn't that go against popular science or the conventional wisdom in science and cosmology today?
It could. So Tom Ward's got a nice reply to this.
Yeah.
So he could be like, I see. You want to push like some Big Bang cosmology stuff. Universe hasn't always existed. And he's like, well, there's a bunch of different scientific theories about a cyclical universe.
Yeah.
So right. Big Bang, Big Crunch. And so we've got a sequence of universes. So God always exists with a universe of some sort because there's some sort of necessity of the cosmos. So God has to exist with some stuff. But, one universe comes and then it goes. Another one comes and then it goes. On and on for all eternity, forever and ever, amen.
Yeah. Yeah, the Bang Crunch. Yeah, I forgot about that. I talked about that in class. Yeah, and you brought that up in the paper. Yeah. Dang, the Bang Crunch gets me because it's like, well, all right, you just toss that in there. It seems a little ad hoc, and it doesn't seem like there's any way to prove that whatsoever.
That is one of the main criticisms, is that, A, there's no way to prove it. B, it seems like the amount of energy that exists in the universe is insufficient to bring about a big crunch. So this is something like William and Craig, and some others, will point this out and say, the standard model, Big Bang model, that's the one that we can actually have good scientific confirmation for. This Big Bang, Big Crunch, you really can't get that. But I'm not a cosmologist, so I'll have to just go, I hope that's right, because I don't like this Big Bang, Big Crunch stuff. But yeah. But actually, you know what? Here's the thing. So a lot of Hindus, their philosophical system is such that you've got a Big Bang, Big Crunch, something kind of like that. You've got a universe that comes into being, and then once 1 year of the Lord, which is I forget how many million years, 1 year of the Lord passes as it comes to an end, then that universe ceases to be, and there's a time period between, where all these souls are just hanging out waiting for the next universe to be reincarnated. And so what you could say is, well, I don't care if there's not enough energy in the universe for the universe itself to bring back a big crunch. That's what God does. God brings about
panentheism. He's more than the universe.
Exactly. So even if like you want to push that back on Tom Ward, him or any number of like Hindu philosophers could go, well, yeah, I've got a story to tell you. Yeah. The universe isn't all the energy there is in the world.
Yeah, and that's something you brought up earlier too. That the model of God is part of your worldview, but it's not the full worldview. So they have a fuller story of the world, and especially if it's coming from Hindu Vedas or whatever, thousands and thousands of years old, it's way less ad hoc. And then go, oh look, there's a scientific theory, and that actually makes sense with what we've been saying for thousands of years.
Yeah, and this is something every like theologian I'm aware of does. So like Richard Rice's work on open theism, he's really clear that this is a perspective on the nature of God. It could really help inform some of our stuff about other aspects of Christian doctrine, maybe not the whole story. It kind of depends on what denomination you're in. So some things that might be like a problem, like some people might go, oh, this is a problem for like open theism. You'd be like, well, I've got some other theological resources I can appeal to help answer this problem when I give you my full worldview instead of just my model of God.
Yeah. And to deny them of that was disingenuous, because we want to do that same thing. Like we should all want to do that. And yeah,
because I don't want to be like just cheating and be like, oh, I've got all these nice ways to get out of all these objections, but you panentheist over there, like you can't appeal to your own religion. You can't appeal to your other like theories. No.
Right.
Like that would just be cheating.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things I brought up in class the other day was that maybe the problem with demarcating panentheism is that we've sought this hardcore, this rigid criteria, and maybe we should go along a sliding scale. And I don't really like the sliding scale stuff, but I thought it's a possible way for them to do this. Why do you think that they can't or shouldn't use a sliding scale to say? Because then it wouldn't be that big of a deal to find Hugh McCann. Yeah, he's on the really shallow end of panentheism. But it's not really anything that serious. How do you argue against that?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this a lot, and you're not the first person to bring this up to me. And actually, Philip Clayton, his response paper, he kind of mentions this too. He's like, well, maybe we don't even need to define the hardcore. And I'm like, okay, well then I don't know what is not panentheism is like one worry. But here's what I think is going to go on. If you introduce a sliding scale, you're going to make things really fuzzy again. And so like consider like a classical theism, like which says that like God's timeless, immutable, impassible, simple. And you're like, okay, cool. That's like on one end of the scale. Well, now what about like Karl Kraus? Again, he's the guy who coined the term panentheism and said he is a panentheist. What does he say? He says God is timeless, simple, immutable, and impassible. And so you're like, okay, what's the sliding scale then between like Kraus and Aquinas? I don't know. Maybe you could go, well, Aquinas affirms creation ex nihilo, and Kraus denies it. And I'm like, okay, but that's not a sliding scale. Those are contradictory positions. There's no middle ground between like contradictions.
Yeah. The problem is you got to make it 14-dimensional, and then you can slide them over here. No, that's a really good point. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, they don't fit nicely on the scale because they're saying different things.
Right. And so here's another way you could try to do it. So you could say, well, I got classical theism on one end and then pantheism on the other. Yeah. And I'm like, okay, well, so classical theism says God and the universe are ontologically distinct. Mm-hmm. And then pantheism says God and the universe are not ontologically distinct. And I'm like, okay, cool. Well, I've got another contradiction. So there's no middle ground. It's either ontologically distinct or not ontologically distinct. So there's no sliding scale again.
Yeah, God's a little bit ontologically distinct. And it's like, well, okay, but yeah, there's no middle ground. That's a third position, and that's the position you have not demarcated.
Right.
Or explicated. Yeah.
Yeah. What would it mean to say it's not ontologically distinct, but it's also like kind of distinct? Like, I don't know. I don't know what that could be.
Well, then they can just pull the Mysterian card that you railed against the other day.
Right. Well, I love the mystery card, if I'm allowed to use it too. But yeah. So I guess I think one of the sliding scale would do, and then why I also think it's really important to demarcate these views is there's a lot of people who've put in a lot of hard work to try to demarcate their views and say, I've got good arguments for my views. Mm-hmm. So think of like Kate Rogers and Ed Fazer. They're like, I've got really good arguments for classical theism. And then like someone like John Peckham or like Tom Morris, they're like, I've got really good arguments for like a neoclassical or modified like model of God. And then like Richard Rice, Greg Boyd, and like William Hasker, they have spent years debating with panentheists and all the process crowd to say, we do not have the same model of God as you. We do have something unique and different.
Yeah.
And they've really like fought that battle. And then like Tom Ward and Benedict Gurka, they're like, I've got excellent reasons for why you should reject, creation ex nihilo and affirm my model, my panentheistic model of God. And then Andrei Bukharev is going to come along and he's like, all you guys are wrong. I've got really good reasons for why you should be a pantheist. And so there's this whole project of people going, I've got a clear model here, and I've got good arguments to go, we've got some common ground on a couple things. Oh, but your view entails all this other stuff that's just my view. Or you've got good reasons to get rid of these things. Or you've got an incoherence in your view. And so this entire project of going, what is the right model of God that Christians should affirm? Like it's all hanging on being able to make some kind of unique claims about the nature of God and the God-world relation. So I think the sliding scale, if my worry is, it would undermine that entire project. And we'd be left asking, if I woke up tomorrow and decided to be a panentheist, would I have to change any of my beliefs? Would I be even committing myself to anything whatsoever? And it feels like I should have to say yes, but if it's a sliding scale, I might not have to change any of my beliefs and somehow could still be a panentheist. And that seems like the wrong answer.
Yeah. That's a great point, and that's a practical point. It's helpful, it's philosophically helpful too. But it's a really practical point too, saying like let's honor each other's work here, and let's be serious. Let's be truth seekers and find the model that best appropriates or speaks of literally, analogically, however you want to parse that, of the God who we say created the universe, whether he sneezed it out or did it by his own intentional will. So, are there are some folks who make these strong claims, scientific, relational, these kind of things. Are there others who, I think we talked about a little bit, but are there others who want to balloon it up and say everyone is a pantheist? There's this kind of move that happens. I think Jordan Peterson does this a little bit, but it's a lot of like the syncretists and folks like this were saying, we're all saying the same type of thing. Are there any prominent panentheists who try to make that move?
There's sometimes when I go to like the AAR and I'm around like the science religion crowd, I feel like that's what's being said. And I'm like, okay. There's a book that was called Panentheism Across the World's Religions. And they were like, look, it's found in every single religion around the world. And they were like, including Taoism and Buddhism. And I'm like, so religions that explicitly deny the existence of God are going to count as panentheists? I feel like I've lost the plot here. Like if an atheist can count as a panentheist, then I don't know what could not count as a panentheist. And so Patrick Hutchings, in his work on panentheism, he reports to be in charge of. There was this big panel discussion at like the World Congress of Religions several years ago, and he was in charge of a panel discussion on panentheism across the world's religions. And he says, like when he left, he emerged none the wiser as to what panentheism is. And then he's like, if I commit myself to panentheism, it seems like I'm committing myself to nothing. Because he's just like, what are you guys saying? It doesn't seem like you're saying anything. And I feel like that does really haunt a lot of what's being said. But then when I look at someone like Benedict Gurka, like he's going, no, I want to demarcate myself here because I think I've got the right view and I think I've got good arguments for it. And so he's gonna push back and be like, you can't just say anything and everything. Like we've got actual claims here.
Yeah, that's so interesting that move, the two types of folks. I think I respect the ones who want to say, here's my position and I will argue for it and come at me and I've made it clear. I respect that much more than there's this book on the simulation hypothesis and Rizvan Verk, and he's a computer scientist, and if he wants to come on the show, he hears this, that's great, come on, let's talk. But he does this thing where he says, the simulation hypothesis explains everything in physics, but also in religion. We're all saying the same thing. Don't you Christians think that, there's another reality out there and there's a creator, designer, and then the Hindus are saying this. And it's like, yeah, dude, if you abstract out and you look at from 1,000 feet and you look at all the superficial similarities, okay, but if I'm committed to then I believe everything. So then believe Christianity too, when he says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Because if we're committing to everything, you're committed to that. And now you have a contradiction as well because you committed to something else. So
So that's why I really like Benedict's point about saying there's a concept of God and then there's these different conceptions or models of God. And so he's like, we all agree, sure, that like God is perfect, absolutely perfect, and the foundation of reality. He's like, we all agree on that. That's fine. But we've got thicker claims here that we're making that do demarcate us, that do distinguish us. Yeah. So sure, we've got a lot of common ground. We've got a lot of things we agree on, but we've got a bunch of other stuff we disagree on. Yeah. And then that's where the arguments come into play.
Yeah. Just a follow up on the concept before we go here. Does a pantheist want to say that their concept of God includes perfection, that God is perfect?
Usually they'll say that, or they'll say that it's the being that's worthy of worship. And when you usually unpack the idea of worship worthiness, this is something that Benedict also points out. It usually you get to like something that's perfect. Then you've got Brian Leftow going, well, it depends what kind of pantheism you've got, because if it's like, kind of like a Mander or like a Bukharev kind of style pantheism, you've got God who's a conscious knower and he's supposed to have all the great making properties. And you're like, yeah, right. Whereas if you have like a purely naturalistic sort of pantheism, where God doesn't know anything because he can't possibly, because he doesn't have consciousness, then Leftow is going to go, well, that's not a being that's worthy of worship, because then part of what it means to worship something is like it can at least recognize your worship. Yeah. If it can't recognize your worship, it's just conceptually confused to say you're worshiping it. I'm so grateful to you, my dear toaster, for anything, and you're like, well, the toaster can't recognize your worship, like.
Or your wrong sense of worship, your misguided worship, right? So then literally anything could be worship for ignoring it completely, not ever acknowledging it. Yeah.
Right. So some pantheists are going to be able to go, I can give you all the great making properties. I can definitely satisfy the conditions for what it means to worship something. God's got all that / identical to the universe. But yeah, God's got all that. Yeah. So there's definitely going to be some are going to say that. Well,
so in our concept, I think I'm hung up on demarcating or finding the difference between the concept and the model, because for some people the concept of God might include being immutable, but you would say, no, sorry, you've moved into your model. Like how do we separate the two?
So all the concept is that it's a perfect being, and it's the ultimate foundation reality. So it's the greatest possible being. And so when you start asking, well, what's the greatest possible being? Well, you're like, well, it's the thing that's got all the great making properties. And it's got them to the like the maximal degree, and it's the source of them as well. So usually a lot of people are like, yeah, that's cool. That's all built in there. All right. Well, which are the great making properties?
Yeah.
And that's where you're like, well, power, that sounds good. And you're like, oh yeah, of course. No one was deny that. Knowledge, goodness. Oh yeah. Okay. Immutability. You got some people like harumphing over there in the corner going, no. So I think that's where I'm like, okay, so we got some claims here now. We're start to see some disagreements, and I'm like, there we go. Now we're starting to get some like actual like models and get some like conceptions up on the table.
Okay, so the concept is it thin? Is it a thinner?
Oh concept? Yeah, it's a very thin concept. Same thing like when you're talking about like different is like what is justice, and so a lot of different moral philosophers are like, well, justice is this. But we've got a bunch of different like thicker conceptions of justice, like retributive justice or distributive justice or something. And you're like, well, we've all got this idea, like underlying idea of like what you deserve or something like that.
Yeah.
But but a thicker claim, that's where people start debating.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. That's really helpful. So once you start fleshing out the concept, then you start moving your model, because now we have debates, and then once the dialogue starts, that's where you're going into your models. Okay. No, that's really great. That's really helpful. Well, this has been huge, man. So if somebody wants to find your future work on this, where can they find? Well, we told them about the first paper. Where can they find the next one?
So the next one on panentheism is going to be in a book. I think it's called Axiology and Monotheism, or no, it's Beyond Monotheism. I think that's what Kurt Lohe's going to call it. But that's not going to come out for a couple of years. But I'll update people on my website at rtmullins.com on that. Okay. And same thing with like any other papers and projects that I'm working on related to these kind of things.
Okay, that's at rtmullins.com. Can they find your podcast there as well?
Yeah, so my podcast is there, and it's also on all the major podcast platforms. So like iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, all the other stuff that people use.
Yeah, and that's Reluctant Theologian, right?
The Reluctant Theologian. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, dude, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, and thanks so much for this paper and thoroughly, confusing me on panentheism. You did such a great job, and yeah, dude, it's just I love your work. So I really appreciate you taking the time to explore it. Help me explore your work on this podcast.
All right, thank you.
Awesome. Well, this is going to have to do it for now, but Lord willing, we'll have another one coming down the pike. But for now, that's going to have to do it. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.